That means that that night, as the old man was hustling across the streets of Old Jerusalem, the shadows lengthening around him, a bolt of cloth under his arm, his life in his hands, every Jewish person that recognized him bowed before him. This was the elite, the aristocracy of Israel. One of the 15 most important men in the entire nation come to get the body of Jesus. With him was a man even older than he was. I doubt very much that there's anybody in this room tonight who's given any serious consideration to where you're going to be buried. I think you have to be a certain age before you worry about that foolishness. I couldn't care less. Joe had already had his grave dug. He was not a kid. Nicodemus was probably older than he was. Wealthy, rabbi, Sanhedrin, teacher of Israel. That was no small title in the first century. And gutsy. Two of the gutsiest men that we've ever read about. One writer, Mark, said that they had to screw up their courage before they went to Pilate, the Roman governor of Israel, to ask for the body of Jesus. I've got money that says they did. Their knees must have been knocking together like tambourines when they walked into the praetorium that night, the governor's palace, because for practical purposes they had committed suicide. Pilate turned out to have been something less than a human being. He was an animal, a beast. He's a man that did that to women and kids, loads of them. He made an unbelievable number of dead people. He was one of the very few Roman governors from anywhere that was ever recalled to Rome for excessive brutality. And that wasn't excessive brutality. That's only what you did to a non-Roman. The penalty for scourging a Roman citizen was execution. There was no law to protect the non-Roman. You could do anything you wanted to do to them. Pilate did that to babies. Ultimately, the Emperor Gaius ordered him home, found him guilty of excessive brutality, and suggested that it might be nice if he fell on his own sword and committed suicide. If he didn't do it, the Legion could help him. Eusebius tells us how he did it. Philo wrote his book around the year 50 down in Alexandria. He described Pilate as a man of a stubborn, obnoxious, hateful, rebellious, spiteful disposition. He had nothing good to say about him. A man whose governorship was characterized by briberies, extortions, executions without trial beyond number. An absolutely lovable individual who wouldn't have thought twice about crucifying two old men on the next two crosses going up. Because that night, when they asked for the body of Jesus, in effect, they were really saying that they were either relatives or family, followers, disciples, believers, anything you might want to call them, in a man that Pilate had just had put to death as an enemy of the state. In other words, they were saying that they were enemies of the state. Of course their knees were knocking together. Who wouldn't be? Fortunately for them, Pilate was more interested in the fact that Joe was trying to say Jesus was dead. And he knew better. He knew that nobody died in 6 hours on any cross. It couldn't possibly have been over 8 or 9 hours since Jesus had stood in front of him. He had condemned it to death, allowing for the time that it takes to actually walk across Old Jerusalem, crucify someone. Jesus couldn't possibly have been hanging on the cross for much over the 6 hours that John said he was. And here's Joe trying to say he's dead? Pilate would never buy that one. And I can't really blame him. You see, the shortest recorded crucifixion that we could find took 36 hours, dying by inches. The longest recorded crucifixion we could find took 9 days. The vast majority of crosses, I believe that includes his, were not raised above the ground. It was too much work. The victim would be crucified lying down, then the cross propped up. His feet would wind up no higher above the ground than the chairs you're sitting in. Lions and hyenas were a real thing in first century Israel. The hyenas are still there. The records indicate that many a man and woman hung there, watched the animal come, and they were eaten alive from their feet up while they hung there like a slab of beef. Vultures sitting on their shoulders, pecking their eyes out while they lived. And no, I'm not trying to make anyone sick. I haven't told you all of it. I'm merely glossing over it. You see, this was life in the first century. We've forgotten it. Pilate saw it every day in the week. He was not about to believe that a man with a chest capacity like that one would die in 6 hours on any cross. That's why he sent for the officer that was in charge of the execution detail, a centurion, the commander of 100 men. We'd call him a captain. It wasn't until that Roman officer could swear an oath to his own commander. Sure, he's dead. I put a spear in him myself just to make sure, or words to that effect, that Pilate would sign the chit that gave Joe permission to take the body off the cross. You can almost read the old man's sigh of relief. We're going to live a little longer. They took off running. In context, nothing else makes sense, because Luke uses a strange term in the Greek. It means that it was the time of the lighting of candles. The stars were beginning to come out. It was the eve of the high holiday, the Passover, the high Sabbath, the second most important day in the Jewish year. And the Jewish day starts at sundown, not sunrise. Based on that term, the time of the lighting of candles, those two old men had something less than an hour in which to live. You see, the penalty for working on any Sabbath was execution. The Jews put you in a rock pile and threw rocks at you until someone broke your head. They called it stoning, the Jewish method of doing it. This was the Roman method. Those two old men didn't have much chance of surviving if they got caught working on the high Sabbath. With Jesus' body, he was altogether too controversial then as well as today. Besides, they were already criminals under one law. Their own Sanhedrin had recently passed a law that said that anyone who admitted to being a follower or a disciple of the carpenter from Nazareth would be excommunicated. Now that gets virtually no one very excited today. But in first century Israel, it was a different story. Excommunication meant certainly you lost most of your temple privileges. But it went far beyond that. No one could knowingly by law walk within 6 feet of you on the street. You were denied the use of the bath. You were denied the use of the razor. You could not be taught in the presence of anyone else. Your testimony was worthless in any court of law. You couldn't hire nor could you be hired in Israel. You couldn't hold a job. You could neither buy nor sell beyond the absolute necessities of life, which the law interpreted to be bread and water. This means that whatever those two old men had been an hour earlier, suddenly they'd become awfully poor men. What good is your money, no matter how much you might have, if you can't purchase something with it? All they could buy was bread and water. Their property automatically reverted to the state. Their wives had no rights. They had sold it all down the tube to take a body off a cross. I don't know what they believed, but boy, they believed something. They disappear from history. There isn't even a believable legend about either one of them. There's a couple legends about Joe, but frankly, your imagination has to be better than mine to accept them. There doesn't seem to be anything on Nicodemus. It's almost as if they've been created to bury someone and disappear, like a few kings I read about, but that's getting philosophical. At that moment of time, they were sweating. All four writers, that makes it historical evidence, tell us something that gets extremely important, that the women watched everything that took place. One writer names four girls: Mary from the village of Magdala, Mary the Magdalene, the other Mary, probably the wife of Clopas, the mother of John Mark. Without question, this was Jesus' own aunt, his mother's older sister. It was common enough in the first century to give two girls in the same family the same name, Mary Beth, Mary Jane, that sort of thing. Many instances of it in literature. A woman named Salome, and his mother was there. John said also the other women who came up with him out of Galilee. So that means historically that there were at least 3 or 4 women, probably Moa, who watched everything that took place. As I said, that gets extremely serious. Now, I cannot prove this, but I refuse to believe that those 4 women sat on a rock and crocheted while 2 old men worked their heads off, simply because I haven't met any 4 women that would do that yet. Besides, if they were there, got caught there one moment after sundown, they too were Sabbath breakers, and the penalty was death. And they'd have been caught, no question. You see, the high priest and the Pharisees were watching everything that took place that night. How could they possibly have gone to Pilate the next morning, at least 12 hours in the future, and pointed out the exact tomb Jesus' body was in? How did they know where he was buried if they hadn't been there the night before watching everything? Is it too much to stretch your imaginations just a little bit and visualize that little burial party throwing one eye over their shoulder at the sun to see how much longer they've got left to live? The other eye at that group in the distance waiting for their bones? They were sweating, and the girls must have helped.